speaking of issues regarding racial bias, when I did my Facebook notice this week, which included the title of Grace's talk, another critic of Justice Southbury said, you guys are the ones who are just divisive. By bringing these things up, you're the ones creating the problems. It's a very standard complaint. Everything would be fine if you guys would just stop talking about race. And I said, well, I'm going to actually be speaking about that this Sunday. And as I always do, I said, come to the rally. You want to know what we're about? Come to the rally. It's public. They apparently declined because I don't see them here. But I want to talk about why I don't believe that what we are doing is divisive. Well, I recognize that by talking about it, we're pushing at it. And that certainly, if you don't talk about it, it's less of a thing. At least it's less of a thing for you. Maybe more of a thing for someone else if we don't help them and we don't be allies. But it's less, it's less uncomfortable if we just don't talk about it. But putting this in historical context, this past week was the 70th anniversary of the decision of the United States Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Ed. And my assumption is that everybody here did at least something about that, read about it, heard about it on TV, refamiliarized ourselves with the importance of that decision, maybe even reflected on, 50 years ago we had Roe versus Wade and we thought that was a settled, solid, United States Supreme Court says that's the kind of country we want. And someone might have mused and said, well, geez, is it possible that another Supreme Court could come along and say, yeah, you know what, that Brown decision was just as wrong as Roe was. And it's okay to have segregation. And sure, that's an issue. That's not why I'm here to talk about. One of the things that happened with Brown versus Board of Ed, it specifically overruled another United States Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. And I want to talk about Plessy, just briefly, without getting too boring. It's probably already too late for that. But I want to talk about Plessy because Plessy is really important. Some of the principles in Plessy versus Ferguson are still important today, even 70 years after Brown versus Board of Ed. In Plessy versus Ferguson, they established the separate but equal idea. They found that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which had been passed about 30 years before it, in the mid-1860s, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson found that the equal protection of the 14th Amendment was satisfied with the separation of races into equal facilities. Some over there, as long as they're equal. So in this case, the actual case, all these decisions, Roe was a woman who wanted an abortion. Plessy was a man who wanted to sit in a particular car on a train. Plessy's great-grandfather was white. His great-grandmother was white. His great-grandfather was white. His great-grandmother was white. His great-grandfather was white. His great-grandmother was white. His great-grandfather was white. And his fourth great-grandmother was black. 7 of his 8 great-grandparents were white. 1 was black. So he was black. So he had to sit over there with them, not over here with us. The Brown case found that this separation was inherently unfair. But in Plessy, they addressed that, and they found that it was fair back in 1896. Remember, Plessy is the plaintiff in that case, and the Supreme Court in 1896 said, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored races choose to place that construction upon it. So if you think that you, with your black great-grandmother, if you're offended by having to sit over there rather than over there, that's on you. That's not on us. That's not on 7/8 of your grandparents. It's on you. So, in other words, if you think that segregation is belittling or embarrassing or dehumanizing, that is on you, not on us. The other striking passage to me in Plessy versus Ferguson is the one that is still as relevant and critical to address 128 years later. I'm going to quote from the decision. The argument of the plaintiff also assumes that social prejudices may be overcome by legislation and that equal rights cannot be secured to the Negro except by an enforced commingling of the two races. We cannot accept this proposition. If the two races are to meet upon terms of social equality, it must be the result of natural affinities, a mutual appreciation of each other's merits, and a voluntary consent of the individuals. And even though it's a terrible decision, there's a lot of wisdom in that last part. Because since that sentence issued by the United States Supreme Court, we've gone through lynchings, Jim Crow laws, redlining, desegregation, busing, civil rights marches, civil rights acts, voting laws, and a continuing concern that black lives haven't always mattered as much as white lives have. Still, when the Supreme Court in that decision, in the separate but equal decision in 1896 said, if the two races are to meet upon terms of social equality, it must be the result of natural affinities, a mutual appreciation of each other's merits, and a voluntary consent of individuals. Individuals like us. Groups like us. Justice Southbury can try to reinforce those natural affinities that we should have for each other just because they look different. We can attempt to cultivate a mutual appreciation of each other's merits. But so much progress ultimately depends on the voluntary consent of individuals. Because we can pass every law in the book. We could elect leaders who say this is so important to the character of our country that we are going to make a pitch on this. It's not going to just be ephemeral marches in the summer of 2020 with groups that faded away, unlike us, but groups that stopped. We could have a country where DEI is important and not taboo, where when the going gets tough, the corporations say that's for us. We are going to stick to our guns, and if there's a backlash, we don't care. We could have that country, but still, racism doesn't leave without the voluntary consent of individuals. And when those individuals who don't voluntarily consent to see each other's merits and to recognize our mutual affinities, until those individuals look at love your neighbor and say, yeah, that's for me, not that's for you guys, not flip me the bird when I hold that sign, as I will 5 minutes from now. When people truly say, that's the important part right there. I love my neighbor. They hit me, I don't love them. But if they're black, I love them. The Asian American, I love them. Hispanic, I love them. LGBTQ, if love your neighbor really was a part of this consent of the individual, that's the country we want, and the community we want. So the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson did a terrible job on the merits of the case. And in the context of a country that was very different at the time, they still were able to recognize that a big part of racism is not in the laws or the leaders, but in the hearts and minds of the people who gather like this and believe it when we say love your neighbor, and are disappointed when others don't do it. And we hope to say in a loving way, please join us in loving your neighbor. And that's what we try to do here each week. And that is why I think even after 4 full years of doing this, with a lot of work to go, because I don't for a minute pretend that now loves their neighbor because of us. But having done this now for 4 years, I think we all can say that we are still fired up and still ready to go. So if you agree with me, let me know. Fired up!
Fired up!
Ready to go!
Ready to go!
Fired up!
Fired up!
Ready to go!
Ready to go!
Fired up!
Fired up!
Ready to go!
Ready to go!
Let's go change the world and tell everyone that the consent of individuals should be here with Love Your Neighbor, so that we can have that hate can have no home here in Southbury, in any other community, or anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Woo!